I'm Michael Green, and the second half here is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be a conversation we're going to have. And I decided I'd start the evening with a sort of twist of conversation. About 2 weeks ago, my son had a birthday. He turned 11. And he introduced me to a new word that I'd never heard before, and the word skid. I don't know if you guys have heard it, but he said to me, "Dad, next year when my birthday comes around, I'm going to be a tween, but this year I'm a skid." And a skid stands for senior kid. And it really struck home for me because the idea that a kid wants to mature is very much the opposite of the way I feel about the way I see a lot of great architects in the world, which is that ability to hold on to the spirit and the joy and the fun and the ambition and the creativity and the innovation that we saw from Bjarke in the first half of this evening. That ability to contain that spirit for your entire career is part of that differentiator that makes one architect rise above. And so there's something really wonderful about that idea of skid that I also thought kind of related to the other reason this half of the evening and what it's about, which is that idea that Vancouver, this fairly young and wonderful city that we all love, is going through this moment, and perhaps tonight is the beginning of that moment of maturing, of jumping what we see in architecture of the last generation and the recent times, and looking to what we can do, as Ian said so eloquently in the beginning of the evening, what we can do to take us to that next step, rise up, and improve the work that we all do. And part of it is bringing inspirational people to the community, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask Bjarke to join me up on stage for this. So Bjarke, if you will. And we're going to have a conversation that both sort of captures the great opportunity to bring this world leader to the stage, and you want to come join me here? This is a bit more informal. And then also captures a series of contributors whose names are up here, who are all seated down here in this area. And Trevor Bodie, who we all know is a great critic. Am I going too far? I have. There's Bjarke. There we go, Trevor. Trevor Bodie's going to help us by, we're going to bring up the lights in this corner, and we're going to try to engage in a conversation where Trevor helps discuss what came about when we went out to the various contributors and asked the question, if you were the chief architect of Vancouver, what would your top priority be? Now, each contributor had some really interesting answers, and we're going to tell you where you can read all of them in detail. But we're going to keep the flow of the evening going, we're going to Trevor's going to talk to some of them. And what we found is that of all these contributors, there was about 4 different themes that came up. The theme of design culture, the theme of the future, issues of the in-between or public space, and finally, a conversation about the challenges we have with the rules and how the rules start becoming obstacles to great work. And so those are the themes, and what I'm going to do is jump right into, again, that list, and the first subject matter, which is the culture. And I think what really came out of listening to you, Bjarke, is that a big part of what we do as architects is the challenge is figuring out how to communicate with what we do and connect with the general public. There's been a sort of disconnect, and we've seen it in Vancouver largely, where the understanding of what architects do and contribute to the community is maybe not resonating with the entire community, and as a result, the importance of architecture hasn't really reached the breadth of the audience that we'd like it to. And what I certainly appreciate about the way you speak about it is that practical reality, the sort of gift of that reality and the opportunity within it. So I don't know if you can add at that point to sort of where you see the role of the architect in connecting with community, but that's where we wanted to start.
Yeah, but it is really like almost always been a focus for us to find ways, because I think architects have maybe we've in general failed to capture the attention and mobilize the imagination of the general public, and I think architecture is quite often misconceived as a sort of an elitist activity, sort of designed by architects for other architects, and also the way we speak about it is quite often sort of untransparent or nebulous, and I think sort of architecture is way too important to be just the concern of architects, because it is really the continuous and collective activity of trying to make our cities and buildings fit better with the way we want to live our lives. And I think the more we as architects can find ways of demonstrating how, our cities are not the way they are because that's what they have to be. Nobody says so. It's just because that's how far we got. And if they don't fit, if they don't work, we not only have the skills and the means and the resources, we also have the responsibility to make sure that they do. And I think to find different ways and through practical examples to demonstrate how architecture is not just a beauty contest, but it's really a question of making this sort of more lively and more interesting and city with more possibilities. And each time we can demonstrate this in ways that come across, people will realize, and they'll start making higher demands. Next time they'll start even fantasizing, what if the city could this and what if the city could this? And I think as soon as architecture is not just some kind of a aesthetic exercise or a question of taste, but really a question of creating capacity and potential, then I think a lot of people would actually be much more invested in it.
I think what that speaks to is this idea that often in the mainstream media we talk about it as the packaging. It's the wrapper of the building and what it looks like, but the story behind it, the meaning that sort of generated that idea, which you so eloquently spoke to in your projects, is often not the story told in the public. And as a result, it almost sort of creates that disassociation for the public of why does that building look that way? Is it just a sort of random fantasy of the architect that somehow removes us from the conversation? And I think that's something that we largely have seen here, is that we haven't sort of bridged the gap, and that sort of importance of buildings improving the quality of people's lives isn't necessarily something we've been able to communicate well in the public. And so how we find vehicles for doing that, I think, is an interesting challenge.
I think often we've maybe also forgotten that was actually a criteria, and it has actually, because a lot of architecture is just facade exercise or cosmetic exercises, and I think so therefore I think maybe also too many times there's been very little to communicate, and so I think it's both things. I also think because architecture is so collaborative that you can hardly design a garage yourself and do it without involving an army of people. And as soon as you do anything that's mildly more complex than that, I think the project that we hope to do on House Street, in the end there might be 300 or 400 different people contributing to that process in one way or the other. So the only way we can ever, if you are a talented singer and piano player, all you need is a piano and your 10 fingers, so you can maybe even do it with less, to express yourself. But as an architect, you need to involve this army of consultants and builders and investors and financiers and politicians and lawyers and neighbors that are complaining or not about what you do. And if you can't get everybody to sign off, if you can't transmit the idea to everybody, it's never going to happen. And I think what's interesting is that architects don't have political power. Nobody does what we say, anyway. And we don't have financial power because we are broke. We work too long for too little. But what we do have is the power of the ideas that we put out there. And I think in group psychology, you talk about naturally emerging leadership. And that is, the naturally emerging leader in any group is the individual that manages to formulate most precisely the shared vision, the one vision that gathers everybody in the group and that responds to the demands and the desires and the concerns of the majority of the group. And I think if we as architects really take a sort of an interest in all of the different aspects of society, and within different fields find tendencies or urges that that find ways of channeling that into our work, we can actually put forward ideas that really manifest and materializes the vision of our collective concerns and demands and desires. And through the power of ideas, we can actually get influence on where the world is going, even though we can either pay for it or decide it.
Exactly. So I think what that also speaks to is the idea that ultimately it's our perseverance that matters the most in our profession, and that, you know, I suppose to some extent you could observe that there is a tendency for some to look at reasons for not being able to succeed, but ultimately those that do in our profession tend to be those that are willing to just fight the battle over and over until they do ultimately succeed in that way. I think what I'm going to ask to do is to kind of engage our participants, is ask Trevor to stand. Can we get the lights over on Trevor over in the corner here? You can't see him at all. And we're going to, Stephen Cox, I think, had a really interesting sort of perspective on this.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. This is a kind of bridge section right now. Bjarke just talked about the power of ideas. I think, you know, a project will come and go, a lecture will come and go, but ideas are resident in the city. A very important part of tonight's conception and an ongoing conception is that we collect ideas and notions about city building. And we start a dialogue, which will only be a kind of tease tonight. We only have time to talk to a handful of contributors. But we'd like to put a few things on the table, notions of where to proceed. And at the very end of the evening, Michael will come back and give some very practical kind of institutional home for what we're doing here. I'm very pleased for the first of our people to be coming up for just a brief little point or two is Stephen Cox, who's the co-founder of Cause and Effect, a very, very powerful and influential multi-design studio branding facility and hub of so much of what goes on in this city. You may also know the Bukachka evenings, Cause and Effect have the master franchise and run those. Stephen contributed a number of points, but one that really stuck out for me was Stephen proposed that what we need to do really, really importantly is to improve the general public's understanding of the role of architecture in Vancouver, and through that understanding, develop a more critical opinion of what could be considered good or worthwhile architecture. Then he goes on to say, we need to develop architecture awareness campaigns that allow our citizens to learn about architecture, to not fear the new, but to welcome it. So Stephen, you want to come up for a sec? You're a brander, you're a designer, you're a graduate architect. What can we do? What devices are there? What strategies can we use to carry forth that agenda you just enunciated?
Whoa. Couldn't have said it better myself. So Bjarke, you said something funny. You said, if people don't know, they can't act. So nobody in Vancouver knows. And I think that that's really, so my point was, you know, you're going to hear a lot of people tonight talk about ways in which we can improve the ability to design better projects. But I guess my thinking is where we need to begin is by acknowledging the fact that we're at a place right now where the general population have a mistrust, a really kind of serious mistrust of the people that are generating the built environment that they live within. And I think that's a really serious problem that we have to address. So before we can worry about the issues around zoning regulations and density transfers and aesthetics, we need to accept the fact that there's a whole bunch of pretty normal people out there who need to understand why this conversation is important. And I mean, I could have just put, you know, 250 condo buyers in this room tonight, and they would have bought that tower. And we wouldn't have had to build a sales center and do all that other stuff and a website and all that stuff, and I would have saved Ian a bunch of money, and we would have been good. But the fact is that we need to educate people outside of that situation. The only conversation that's going on right now in Vancouver is a sales conversation. And it's run by guys who we all know. And we need to establish a conversation which is about why architecture is important, why development's important, why public space is important. And it's not so much about, you know, granite countertops or my view. So that's it.
Yep, you're next. Yep. Thank you, Stephen. Our next contributor is James Chang, principal of James K.M. Chang Architecture, one of the most influential and city-transforming architectural practices we've known. Right from his first work here for Arthur Erickson on Robson Square to the present, Jim has maintained a dual interest as urban designer and as designer of buildings. Our contributions, by the way, of the 20 varied enormously in length. Stephen's, as you might have guessed, was a little bit longer, but pointed. But Jim had a really succinct and to the point suggestion. It's exactly 5 words, and I'm going to ask him to expound on it. But here's Jim's contribution to the question. Don't forget the rhetorical question about what you would do, what the chief architect would do for Vancouver. Here's Jim Chang's suggestion. It's simply look back to look forward. Tell us what you mean by that.
Well, thanks, Trevor. I don't think I have to explain it. I mean, Bjarke has based his whole lecture on that. Everything he's done, from the building in Vancouver, Talon, Park City, it's all looking back before he looks forward. And I think for a new chief architect coming into Vancouver, he or she should understand what Vancouver is all about, what we have been through, how we came to where we are before going forward. I think it's just a natural thing to do. We're only 100 years old, so we don't have a lot to look back, but we do have a lot of good bones.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Super. Now back to our next topic, which Michael introduced.
Yeah, so the next topic sort of we summarize as the future. And what was interesting when we got all the participants to offer that question, the answer to that question of what they would do, the issue of sustainability didn't actually come up, which was a real surprise in a way. The issue of sustainability in a way is something that's become so much a part of our day-to-day conversation that it sometimes is hard to realize and sort of break through the status quo part of that conversation and see what it really is. When we consider that 50% of the energy in our, that we use in North America is in buildings and 50% of the greenhouse gases is in buildings, whereas only 28% is in transportation, you have to ask yourself why buildings aren't sort of the main topic of conversation as compared to cars in our sort of mainstream media. We also have to sort of recognize that there probably is no other industry besides architects and engineers that will be able to tackle the issues of climate change and energy greater in modern society than architects. So the interesting choice was not to speak to sustainability, and I think, Bjarke, you speak to it in a very interesting way, the complete sort of systemic sort of way you're looking at your projects that we're not really seeing here. And before I ask you to comment on that, I just want to bring up a comment that came out yesterday in the design panel from Stefan Benish, I believe, who said that in his sort of observation, none of the buildings here in Vancouver would actually be allowed to be built in Germany, given the energy codes and performance standards in Germany as compared to here. We're a city that wants to be the greenest city on the planet, as all cities should and want to. How is that actually going to inform us, and how much do you think that'll change, hopefully change the way all of our buildings here ultimately are developed? The green glass city, is it something we really can expect to hold on to, or is that day over for us from a performance point of view?
I think, I mean, it's also, it is true that because power traditionally has been so cheap in in North America, and it's been so incredibly expensive in Northern Europe. The standard Danish building code is above and beyond LEED Platinum, simply because that's where legislation took things, and I mean that is a very easy way to intervene. You can just make it illegal not to perform. But I think it's also important to remember that there's more to life than saving on your energy bill. In the first oil crisis in Denmark, when OPEC formed, I think it was like 71, or then like everybody just went nuts on the building regulations. And back then it was all about insulation and diminishing window sizes, because like there hadn't been advances in insulated units. And so we have like this onslaught of buildings from the 70s all the way up to the early 80s, where in each room there's a window this size, and it's like totally hermetic. It gets like humid inside just from your perspiration, and like everybody of my generation have allergies towards everything, because like we grew up in these like hermetic boxes with no windows. So I think, and that's not the answer. And I think a lot of the dogma about sustainability has been sort of, yeah, it's great, but what's the energy bill? Like, where is it LEED? And I think the main purpose of why we're doing what we're doing is that, like almost if you look at evolution, it's like a sidetrack, and it's a very long sidetrack. But if you look at evolution, life on this planet evolved by adapting to the environment and to changes in the environment. So, when the fish stranded, it started using its flippers to move, and they evolved into legs. And when we escaped the tiger into the trees, we got so good at using our hands that we could suddenly have opposing thumbs, and sort of gradually. And at this moment, something happened when we invented tools and technology and architecture. We got the capacity to actually not continue adapting life to changing the environment, but actually to adapt our environment to life. That's what we didn't have to live in a cave anymore, or we didn't have to inhabit a tree. We could actually make our own cave, and we could start transforming. So that's why geologists refer to our time right now as Anthropocene, which is like the human-influenced geological age. And this is a great thing, because we live longer, we have lower infant mortality, we can distribute wealth. So it has allowed us, essentially everything that has caused global warming is because of the incredible success of a carbon-fueled economy. It's done so many good things that it's been all over the place, and now it starts becoming an issue. So it doesn't mean that we should sort of step back. We should just find ways of delivering this quality of life and continue this increase of quality of life in ways that won't keep emitting carbon and diminishing our life quality in the future. But I think the happy news is that the definition of pollution is when you have a process that delivers a product that everybody wants, so therefore you maintain the process. However, it also has a byproduct that nobody cares about. So as you keep maintaining the process to deliver the product, the byproduct starts accumulating until it actually becomes piles of trash or CO2 in the atmosphere. But what that also means is that all pollution is an almost infinite and renewable resource for something you haven't invented the use for yet. And essentially that's the logic of ecosystems, that there are no dead ends. The excrement of one living organism becomes the nutrition of another living organism. The exhaust of one living organism becomes the intake of another. And that's why we somehow have to sort of put on this thinking that that all pollution is essentially an infinite resource that we haven't yet found the benefit of.
One of the things that came out of the contributors' ideas was that it's not just that closed loop and that quality of sort of sustainability that sort of defines the forms of our buildings, but it's also this issue of durability, and it's that tendency that we have started to create a fairly disposable culture of building, and that we haven't sort of changed that perspective, and we were building for that 20-year term. And I think you largely could suggest that architects, we have that legacy mind, and we think of our projects in terms of centuries, and ideally a goal of centuries, as opposed to perhaps the shorter return of selling off condo units and sort of looking at a short-term return. Is there a way that we can start, in your mind, thinking about the issue of durability as part of that function of sustainability and the choices we make in the way we design our cities?
I mean, I think first of all, if you do great work and create great spaces, then people are going to love them, and they're actually going to care for them, and they'll last. I was speaking with CBC in the break, and they asked, all this sustainable stuff, it's got to be very expensive. How can you pay for this sustainable stuff? It's got to be expensive. And then I just told them that a friend of mine from Sweden, he gave me a T-shirt that says, if you think good architecture is expensive, then try bad architecture.
Sweet. Trevor, so good. Can we pick up on Trevor?
Back here, the T-shirts with that message on it will be on sale in the lobby right afterwards. I'd like to ask Omer Arbel to come up, and he's got a point or two, one of which deals with the whole idea of durability that I think is worth quoting back to him, and then we'll ask Omer to expand. Omer first came to international prominence really through his role as design director of Bocce. But more recently, increasingly important is Omer Arbel Office, his design wing, if you want, of buildings. I'm happy to report that his 23.2 house got award for the best single-family house in Surrey in the last decade. Wonderful creation. But here is what Omer has suggested when we asked him the same question. Quote, double allowable densities across the board for the entire city and legislate expenditure of a sizable portion of resulting profits on design quality and on construction longevity. Tell us what you mean, Omer, and how it would be done.
We call ourselves the greenest city in the world, or at least we aspire to be. But most of new construction that occurs here is built to last at most 30 years. That's a disaster because the resources required to demolish and rebuild any building far outweigh any kind of green strategy that we can employ in constructing the building in the first place. So lead these kinds of legislative or regulatory kind of frameworks are actually meaningless. So my proposal is to say, what if every new building in Vancouver was legislated to be constructed such that it lasts 200 years at least? When you start thinking about what that might mean, you realize that it's a completely impossible exercise because we can't even predict what technology might make available to us as architects 10 years from now, let alone 200 years from now. But so it's a kind of point of vertigo. You're lost. You're standing on the brink of something you don't understand. But in that point of vertigo, you find that the only thing that actually does retain its value over the course of, say, 200 years or longer is some sort of cultural value. And that's where architecture is meaningful, because we might not be able to predict the trends in technology and culture for the next 200 years. But if we make a cultural contribution in the way that we design a building today, that cultural contribution will last, and it'll mean that it's not demolished over time. That's why we maintain our current heritage culture. That's why we care about preserving old buildings today. And if we're able to do that, just invest cultural value, that's why design is important, that's why architecture is important, in what we build now, that's the only thing that can kind of propel us into the future.
Thank you very much, Omar. Now I'd like to ask Bruce Hayden to come up. Bruce is a partner in the National Firm Dialogue, but Bruce is also a true civic intellectual maintainer of the civic fabric as president of the Contemporary Art Gallery. And yesterday, I'm very, very impressed to see Bruce and Jim in action at Design Panel with Bjarke as part of the local team, and talking specifically about the textures and qualities of the city. I'll just read you one of the several points that Bruce raised in his contribution. Bruce suggested that we need to invigorate Vancouver as a global center for architectural adventure by offering developers a 20% density bonus and automatic rezoning approval for designs selected through open international competitions. Why should we do it? What would result in?
Well, I think it's worthwhile stepping back. I mean, most of the rules and regulations that Michael referred to actually evolve out of a system of good intentions and responsible governance. It's not about stupid people adding things for the sake of making our life more complex as architects. But the difficulty is that the accumulation of those rules and regulations means that the game goes to the masters of the mediocre. It's the people that start to understand the direct application of complexity and really work it down to the place where you can't ever criticize it because it meets all the intentions, but what it lacks is passion. And so the architectural competition is a way that we can start to invigorate not just a bureaucracy, but a culture with it, kind of infuse it and inoculate it with passion. And I think what we've seen with the work that Bjarke has presented is it's jumped the game. It changes the conversation beyond how we've done things normally. And we have to find ways to do that, to refresh ourselves. And if we fail to do that, what we then do is we accept just this ongoing accumulation of the ordinary. And I think that the skyline of Vancouver too often has been a direct representation of that ongoing accumulation of the ordinary. And I'll give you a very concrete example of how this can work. In two of my Toronto partners, Antonio Gomez-Policio and Jennifer Kiesmat, were central in doing exactly this in the city of Mississauga, where what they did is they organized an international architectural competition for a tower in Mississauga. And the jury was composed of 3 civic officials to take care of the public interest. You have to do that. 3 international architects, and 3 members of the developer team. And it was only if the developer bought in that the tower would get built. They saved at least a year on the development approval times. They got a massive amount of free publicity, which is extraordinary. And the competition was won by a 28-year-old Chinese architect. So the other bonus is it would be fabulous if this city became the launching point for an extraordinary number of careers that had global influence.